discussion brought to you by the Carnegie Middle East Center, homing in on a climate change action, aspirations and setbacks leading up to COP27, which is what? Just over 10 days away now. It's upon us already. I'm Nick Clark, Environment Editor for Al Jazeera English, and this whole arena, of course, is a critical area for our daily output. On some days, climate and all things environmental can take up to 50% or more of our programming, such as the impact of the climate crisis that is upon us. A very warm welcome to our audience across Facebook and YouTube. We're very happy to field questions from you as this event proceeds. Just send in your thoughts and questions, and we'll do our best to get them to the panel. So let's dig in. Now, ahead of these annual UN climate conferences that we rather mysteriously call COPs, there's always a raft of reports highlighting the dire straits the world is in. And this year is only different in the degree of warning that emanates from all of these reports. And very real and very troubling these warnings are. Let me quote you a couple. The window is closing, says the UN Environment Programme's emissions gap report. Global health is at the mercy of fossil fuel addiction, warn scientists in the Lancet. Conversely, the International Energy Agency says that the invasion of Ukraine, while causing an immediate energy crisis, will actually accelerate the clean energy transition. Interesting. So we're going to talk about all of that and an awful lot more with our guests today. So let me welcome, first of all, in Singapore, we have Aisha Al-Sari, who is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. Over in Washington, D.C., Hamzawy, director of the Carnegie Middle East Program. And in Houston, in Texas, Zeinab Shuker, who's assistant professor of sociology at the Sam Houston State University in Huntsville in Texas and climate change fellow at the Institute of Regional and International Studies. Welcome to you all to what promises to be a fascinating discussion. First up, we this year have seen some pretty brutal impacts of the climate crisis, from the floods in Pakistan to drought and to heat waves right around the world, wildfires in the United States and Australia and so on. But how is the climate crisis directly impacting the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region? What kind of things are we seeing here? Aisha, if we could start with you.
Great. Yes, sure. So thank you very much for the introduction, Nick, and good evening from Singapore. In terms how the Middle East is impacted by the climate change, the Middle East region is classified as one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of the climate change. And the impacts of the climate change are already happening in the region. The region is, the temperature in the region is increasing twice as fast compared to the other parts of the world. The region has, over the past 3 decades, the temperature has increased in the region by 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 0.7 degrees Celsius increase globally. And the high record temperatures has been already witnessed across different cities in the region. For example, there has been records for high temperature that exceeded the 50 degrees Celsius, for example, in Kuwait and in Iraq. And this actually most recently has been increasing and happening more frequently in the region. Climate change is also impacting the patterns of the rainfall over the region. Climate models suggest that the rainfall in general will decrease over time over the region. And also what the region has been witnessing over the last few years is the increase in the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events. And that include, for example, the exposure to the cyclones. I can name few of them, Cyclone Gono, Chibala, and others that have been hitting the region and causing sometimes the flash floods that the region has been witnessing this year and last year more frequently, as well as sandstorms. Now, the Middle East region is also, it is featured with arid climate condition. So there are already challenges out there because of this kind of environmental conditions, including, for example, the water scarcity and security, the food security, the energy security, and climate change is exacerbating those existing challenges. Another thing that the Middle East has already been experiencing as a result of the climate change is the link between climate change and the human security in the region. And examples we can think of are the Arab Rising that happened in Tunisia and in Syria back in 2011. Actually, if we look at what happened in that specific time, there has been elongated period of drought, and that has influenced the food prices. And as a result, we have seen, a protest happening. But this kind of like the human security issue is also now we can see the implications in other countries and happening more frequently. And we can think of an example of Iran as well. We have seen last year, for example, protests in Kazakhstan, in Iran, and these protests has been because of the experience of the blackout of electricity. But if we dig deep and see what has been the cause, it is there has been an elongated period of drought again, which affected the flow of water that actually used to produce the electricity there. And unfortunately, also these demonstrations are associated with some losses as well.
Sure. So very real, very present, some multifaceted issues that result from the climate crisis. Zeinab, you've focused a lot of your research on Iraq, a country like many in the MENA region facing lots of disparate challenges. Mm-hmm. How there? Let's focus more on the kind of the aspects of day-to-day life. How does it exacerbate the challenges of daily life there?
So first of all, thank you. Good morning from Houston. I wanted to start by saying that the climate crisis has been long in the making in the Middle East. We know, for example, that between the 1960s and the 2010s, greenhouse gas emission has increases by 6-folds in the region compared to 2.5-folds globally. So that's a problem. We also know that not all countries contribute equally to that, specifically countries that are rentier economies that depend on production of oil and gas. They contributed about 74% to that increase. So countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, et cetera, have contributed significantly to that. And so adding to Aisha's point, we are seeing this increase in temperatures, increase in sand and dust storms, increase in droughts and intensity of droughts. And the problem is that not all countries in the MENA region are equal or are the same. There are certain countries like Iraq that are fairly vulnerable to climate crises compared to other countries. So Iraq is both a contributor to the climate crisis because of its dependency on oil and gas, but it's also because of its weak institutions, because of its hybrid nature of its political regime. It's really in a vulnerable position to respond to that. And so the impact of this vulnerability and increased pollution in the area, and specifically in Iraq, had let us witness a really rough summer of increase in frequency and intensity of sand and dust storms, very prolonged droughts. We are all seeing the images of like the dry marshland, the dead buffaloes. It's floating all around social media and the internet, and we can see it. And the outcome, it's these events are specifically impacting the most vulnerable communities in Iraq. Because of Iraq's rentier economy and the nature of its dependency on oil, the agriculture sector is kind of marginalized. Irrigation systems are outdated. It depends on flooding, and when you have less water, flooding is not an effective way to water your farm. And so a lot of farmers and a lot of folks who live and depend on the agriculture sector are finding themselves with very limited water access. Their land is dying, and many of them are forced to either cut their production significantly. They're not making any profits, or some are forced to leave their land and go to already overpopulated urban centers with limited infrastructure. And they are marginalized and sort of into these enclaves, these unplanned living quarters that's kind of outside of the city jurisdiction with limited infrastructure and resources. So we are already seeing that. We are already seeing the climate crisis in front of us. If we think of sand and dust storms, we know that increase in sand and dust storms, and we're expecting that to increase with the upcoming years. It impacts oil production. It stops transportation, and it's impact, the ability of, different oil fields to operate effectively. It increases the cost of cleaning and fixing equipment. So for a country that depend on oil mainly, it's both a contributor to the climate crisis, and that increase and worsening of climate condition, it's impacting its economic system and its only source of revenues, but it's only impacting its political and human security. And we're only seeing the start of it now. And again, the problem with limited institutional capacity, it's only going to get worse, unfortunately.
Zeinab, thank you for that. It's a great illustration from one country of the challenges that so many are facing. And Amr Hamzawy in Washington, D.C., if I could bring you in now. So how does a nation like Iraq respond to the climate crisis in simply two ways? First of all, in simply adapting to it, and secondly, in trying to contribute to the fight against it, because surely a nation like Iraq, it's next to impossible to do that when it's, it needs all the power it can get, it needs all the income it can get from its oil reserves.
Right. Good morning. First of all, good morning from Washington, D.C., and a pleasure to join you and our virtual crowd wherever they are. So yes, I mean it's a great question. Let me start by reiterating a point which the previous speaker was just making about how state capabilities vary across the Middle East and North Africa, and it's an important point to keep in mind. Because Iraq is a case in point, as the previous speaker said, it has contributed to the climate challenges we're facing in the region. A great part of the climate challenges we're facing in the region are not of the making of the region, but they are impacts of the global climate change and the global phenomena which we have been living with throughout the last decades. Addressed to a slight extent in the last few decades, but we are in a way in the Middle East and North Africa, although oil producing and oil exporting countries have contributed to green gas emissions, many of the region have the understanding of the region being a victim of global trends which we haven't contributed to. And this is an important issue to keep in mind, because when we come to discuss COP27, this is part of what we're hearing in different places in the region, and it needs to be reflected on to an extent, because it's a true reflection of reality as it has been evolving in the last decades. But now back to the main point I would like to make. State capabilities vary across the region, and we have a big dividing line between nation states which have survived the last decade of turmoil, of political uprisings, of economic and social crises, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic. We have a clear dividing line between countries, primarily in the Gulf, the GCC, and nation states, to an extent Morocco, to an extent Algeria, and to an extent Egypt, which have developed over the last years state capabilities, allowing them to address some of the aspects of the climate risks. And I will come to identify what climate risks I'm looking at as a political scientist. State capabilities which have accumulated over a longer period of time and allow these countries to launch initiatives to address some of the risks related to climate change. And we have a second group in the Middle East of basically dysfunctional, disintegrating states, Libya, Syria, Yemen, states in protracted crises, Lebanon and Iraq, where here oil producing or oil non-producing is not the main variable you're looking at. The main variable you're looking at is the structure of nation-state institutions. And so the second set of states in the region simply does not have capabilities to address climate change, and does not have capabilities to plan in a medium term or long term way to address what the previous speaker and what the first speaker was were referring to. We have a projected increase, an expected increase in temperatures in the region up to 4 degrees until 2050, and it will basically turn some places in Iraq uninhabitable. I mean, we're expecting 50 Celsius in some places in Iraq and in Iran, and other places, Libya, Algeria, Yemen. And here it comes down to what kind of state capability so we are looking at. So the first point I'm making, we have a clear divide in the region, and it's not only an oil producing and oil non-producing countries. It's a bit more than that, very much related to the political history of the region and to where nation states and nation states institutions stand.
But Amr, if I could just jump in there, the point is
sure.
from everything that's been said so far, is that it's the responsibilities of the richer nations, wherever they get their wealth from, to try and assist the poorer nations like Iraq to deal with this transition. I mean, not just the transition to renewable energy, but actually to exist, as you say. I mean, that's the biggest challenge.
Right. So that's exactly it. I mean, I wouldn't say that Iraq is a poor nation. It's not. I mean, it's a country rich of resources, but what makes Iraq effectively poor is the poor governance. And here I come to the second point I'm making. So for us in the Middle East and North Africa to understand how climate change impacts our daily life, our realities, what kind of challenges it puts forward, we have to correlate climate change to two factors. One is social vulnerability. We have pre-existing vulnerabilities in the region, which are related to poverty, which are related to macroeconomic indicators, related to social marginalization, and so on and so forth. So we have to correlate climate change and measure the impacts of climate change on pre-existing vulnerabilities. It has an exacerbating effect, it has a maximizing effect sometimes, and sometimes it creates a totally different field we're looking at. For example, the traditional map of vulnerable communities in the region is changing. Vulnerable communities in the region used to be primarily ethnic and religious minorities. If you look at it from a socio-political perspective, if you look at it from a gender perspective, women, elderly women, of course, more than young women, women in rural, elderly women in rural areas, more than young women in urban places, and so on and so forth. And if you look at it from an economic perspective, impoverished sections of populations, impoverished segments of population, we have an increase in poverty, not everywhere in the region, but overall in the Middle East and North Africa, we have a per capita increase in poverty. The number of people living on less than $2 per day has increased from, in 2011, it was around 7% to an 11% as of today, according to the World Bank. So climate change comes in and has an impact on pre-existing risks. But
Exactly.
it adds to the map, of vulnerable communities.
Indeed.
It adds to, just one point, it adds to vulnerable communities. We have illegal immigration, we have migrants communities in the region, and this is all an impact of climate change and sub-Saharan African countries moving up and trying to find ways. So we have to look at it in light of pre-existing and added risks in each MENA society.
Yeah, the risks are manifold and interconnected. Zeinab, if I could come to you now, this concept of the division within the region, and given that for many countries it's powered and empowered by fossil fuels, what do you think the responsibilities are of the richer nations in MENA to help the poorer countries deal with what's going on, the crisis, some people call it a catastrophe that's unfolding?
No, I absolutely agree with what Omar said earlier. I think, again, Iraq is not a poor country, but it's a country that is very weak in institutional capacity, right? Its political institution is hybrid. It's, there is no clear center of power. There's division of power within multiple competing actors. So that's really undermined state capacity and its ability to respond to a climate crisis. And it's also tend to deprioritize green energy, diversification, supporting the agricultural sector, industrialization, and so on. So I think the better framing is, instead of saying rich versus poor countries, is saying countries with higher institutional capacity that will be able to support countries with less institutional capacity. The thing is, specifically in the Middle East, climate change doesn't accept or recognize man-made borders. So a threat in one country, because of its limited institutional capacity, which will increase the impact of climate change in that place, will impact other places as well. When we think of Iraq and we think of the sand and dust storms that happened in the summer, Iraq couldn't really respond to it very effectively, but the impact of sand and dust storms reached Kuwait. And it halted transportation in Kuwait, and it impacted, oil and gas production in there. And so it's really a cross-border situation, and many of the Gulf countries have better state capacity compared to places like Iraq. And so one of the really important things that could be done is really emphasizing climate diplomacy between different MENA countries, right? Countries in the region. And instead of kind of engaging in individual climate response, which is what we're seeing, places like Iran, for example, they are facing their own water crisis and drought, but their response to it often has been kind of build dams and try to monopolize water as much as you can to minimize political threats and political instability. We're seeing that as well with Turkey. And so it's limiting the amount of water coming down to Iraq. But on the long run, that is not sustainable. Because lack of water in Iraq, droughts in Iraq, will lead to political and economic stability because of pre-existing conditions. And that will eventually bleed out to both Iran and Turkey and Gulf states and the larger region. And so it's necessary to create better climate diplomacy, create institutional norms that can, and organizations that can facilitate these kind of conversations between different MENA countries, and really focus on building resilient institutions. That is where it all comes down to. Just to bring another example, we know, for example, with Syria and Sudan, the conflict that happened in Syria, it wasn't the first time there was a drought in Syria. In fact, there was a drought before that was really severe as well, but it did not lead to the same level of political instability. But it was the time where institutional capacity was at its lowest. So the impact of climate change worsened the already pre-existing conditions. So institutional capacity diplomacy is really crucial at navigating and negotiating these conditions as we see it.
Thank you, Zeinab. But Aisha, better climate diplomacy and cooperation between MENA countries very much required. But how could that take shape, do you think? It's not exactly a region that's renowned for its cooperation.
Climate change are transboundary in nature. So now we are like leading up to the COP27. We put a lot of hope on the COPs and especially for the MENA region, where the adaptation to climate change is a priority for the region. So we put hope on the finance that the developed countries should mobilize to developing countries. But I would like to say we should not wait for that to happen. It might take time for that agreement to mobilize the adaptation fund for developing countries. And for
We've
the
been waiting a long time for that finance, haven't we? I mean, it was 100 billion a year was talked about back in Copenhagen, I think it was in 2009, and still hasn't been delivered.
And it didn't happen, right? So it might be too late to wait for that to happen. But for the MENA region, since we are experiencing the impacts of the climate change out there, I think, yes, the regional cooperation is key. And as Zeinab mentioned, the MENA countries face this similar challenges, but they differ in terms of the institutional capacity, as well as in the economic and the financial capacity, where they can actually work together in mobilizing those capacity in between each other. Now, we have written actually a report back in 2018 or 19, where we look at the regional governance and cooperation in the Arab region. And we try to identify the institutional and the governance structures out there. Well, there are some institutional architectures out there that governs the regional climate issues, including under the Arab League. And then also, for example, the Gulf Cooperation Council, it does have a committee on climate change. As well as there are some international organizations that play a role in actually trying to bring the different stakeholders in the MENA region to work together to address different climate issues like the water. And these organizations like the ESCWA, the UN, and the World Bank, these international organizations play an active role to bring the stakeholders together. However, what we realize, like where these institutions are there, the issue is more about how operational those institutions out there. And we looked at for example, the regulations. There are some regulations that concern the climate and the environment. However, they remain unupdated. For example, there was an environmental regulation that was issued in 1992, but it has never been updated later on. And we don't also know if these are implemented regionally. So there was an issue also of the transparency of those institutions. And again, also that it was the issue of the human capacity. And I think also for the MENA region, for example, the World Economic Forum actually it conducted a report where it looks at the top risks that the people think that they are impacting them. And for the MENA region, the climate-related issues, they don't come to the top 10 risks. People think that the job creation, other risks are priority for them, but not the climate-related issues. And here comes the point of the awareness of the impacts of the climate change, both at the government level and at the citizens level, although it is really felt and the people can speak about it. So that is actually making it challenging to integrate the concern of climate in the governance level across the MENA region.
This is critical what you're saying here, isn't it? And we've got a worldwide audience, and questions are coming in thick and fast. And there's focus on the economic situation that has been talked about since we started really here in the region. And the question basically comes down to how does the economic crisis, for example, in Egypt and in Tunisia, impacts those countries' capabilities to face climate change? Amir, can I throw that one to you?
Sure. Yes, I mean it's a great question, and in a way, I mean, the impacts are imminent, at least at two levels, and I would like to simplify the correlation between climate change and existing social and economic long-term social and economic crises. Number one, climate change, in order to address its challenges and to get started in a short-term, medium-term, or long-term plan to do climate adaptation or climate mitigation, you need to devote state resources. And if state resources are stretched thin due to existing social and economic crises, climate change basically adds to the mix and puts more restraints on existing limited state capabilities, be it institutional capabilities or resource capabilities. For example, if you look at the correlations between the food insecurity, where the Middle East and North Africa has come to suffer more from food insecurity due to the Russian war on Ukraine and its impacts on supply chains, as well as the spike in food prices, and of course in oil non-producing countries in energy prices. This has restrained government resources, institutional resources, natural resources, financial resources, and then it means that whatever you have to address climate change challenges becomes less. The second, so that's sort of a zero-sum game, a loss-loss equation that's very simple to understand and look at. The second point, which is to my mind more relevant for those who are engaged in projecting what will happen and seeing how governments can address and civil societies can address climate challenges, the fact that climate change comes in and in fact adds to pre-existing risks. It makes economic and social crises more challenging for governments to manage. For example, we have social vulnerability related to impoverished segments of the population. Climate change in a place like Tunisia has meant increasingly in the last years, and Tunisia is a country with some institutional capabilities, unlike Iraq, unlike Syria, unlike Yemen and Libya. However, climate change has impacted the livelihood of farmers' communities in different places in Tunisia, especially in the northern region, in a way which meant to a great extent the loss of their livelihood. And here you go, you have an added community to the map of vulnerable communities, which the Tunisian government has to address using social safety schemes and what have you. So it exacerbates existing social and economic risks as well. So at these two levels, we've got to look at how climate change interacts and correlates with existing economic and social crises.
Indeed, Zeinab, I'm just wondering. Many would ask, especially if you're living in poverty, why should they even be thinking about climate change as a priority when they're just living hand to mouth? And indeed, for governments who are just thinking more concerned with jobs, with the keeping the economy alive, and all those issues being more perhaps of an urgent consideration. And this concept of the climate crisis not being immediate, even though it is upon us with the dust storms and the droughts and so forth. How do you navigate that difficulty?
Well,
actually, I'm just passing that one on to Zeinab, and we'll come back to you.
Sure,
a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, no, this is a great question, right? And one of the problems is that the region experienced so many problems in terms of security, in terms of conflict, in terms of economic and political instability, and so on, that oftentimes these things are prioritized not only by governments, but also by international actors. And so climate change is always kind of pushed to the side, right? It's not immediate, it's not happening as we like now, even though it is. And so let's focus about the Arab Spring. Let's focus about Iran and its relationship to Iraq and so on. But climate change is a real risk, and one essential thing is to prioritize that. You asked earlier, what can superpowers do? And really, superpower need to reprioritize the region. So we know, for example, that sort of the US is kind of de-emphasizing the region when it comes to its foreign policy. We're looking at China more engaged in economic projects rather than sustainable climate-related economic projects. So the climate need to be prioritized by both superpowers and international and national countries. But another crucial thing, like you mentioned, is really one essential way to deal with climate change is to demystify climate change and the climate crisis to the average person. So the different communities are dealing with climate change, right? When we talk about folks in rural Iraq, dealing with droughts, dealing with dead buffaloes, dealing with sand in the storms, they're seeing this. And many of them have lived on this land from one generation to the next. So they have the knowledge about the land. But oftentimes there's less connection about what they are seeing in front of them and between sort of the larger thing that is the concept of climate change. It tends to be mystified, and that's the problem. It needs to be demystified so both governments
How do you do that?
Well, there are different ways to do it, right? There is ways to do it via education, via dedicating more resources to, engage children in schools, etc. But also there's a structural problem. You need more free civil spaces where civil organizations dealing with climate change can both raise awareness and can challenge state policies around that. And this is sort of one other problem that kind of make the region more vulnerable is that there's not a lot of free civil spaces in the region, right? The region is not very democratic. And so you need to create, and this is the thing, there needs to be a reckoning, not only with economic institutions, but also with the political institutions. You need to have civil activism and freedom around conversations of climate change that can both provide insights about how the communities work, but also challenge existing state policy around diversification of its economy, around its climate policies, around its diplomacy with neighboring countries. And so there need to be that. And it's a little bit challenging how to do that in countries where democracy and civil freedoms tend to be limited, or challenging the state tend to be a problem.
To say the least. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? That, all of these are important, valid concepts, aren't they? And there certainly needs to be a reckoning. As the emissions gap report, which only came out yesterday, it speaks to this urgent need. This is globally, speaks to this urgent need of a complete revamp of the way the world works, which is, I mean, to say nothing of the MENA region, just around the world, wherever you look. That is a decades-long project, isn't it? And we, quite frankly, we don't have time. Aisha, can I come to you on that?
Yes, thank you very much. Building on what Zeinab has mentioned, and I would focus on the Gulf Arab states specifically. So although like this region is vulnerable to the issues of the climate change, for example, the water scarcity is an issue, insecurity is an issue there, but because like the water and the electricity has been subsidized for a long time for this specific group of countries, and people don't feel that they need to reduce their water consumption. They don't feel that they need to reduce their electricity consumption because they have access to it. They don't feel like there's an issue of the water scarcity there. And this, have created this unsustainable pattern of consumption over time. Now, the people don't feel it, but who is feeling it is the government. So the government, because of the fluctuations on the oil prices in the international market, have felt the pressure that has been put on the state budget. And for that reason, the governments across the GCC have tended to price reforms for the energy sector. And that is the incentive to put a pressure over the people to reduce the consumption of the electricity, for example, as well as the other types of the fuel. And so I think behavioral change is key to tackle climate change. But we need to understand the specific context of the country that we are dealing to it. For the GCC, perhaps the awareness and the importance of climate change is not we are not aware of it right now, but the economic pressure is the driver to make that change. And this is what has been happening so far. And there are some studies that came out to measure the reduction and the consumption of the electricity and water because of the price reforms, and the change has been felt. So there was a reduction on the consumption of the electricity and water because of the reduction of the subsidies that the government put out there. So for the GCC countries, I think what would play a role in changing the behavior is actually the economic incentives that the government can put out there. And again, it is economic motivation for the GCC. It's because of what's happening in the international energy market, but not necessarily because of the pretty much an interest in addressing climate change or the interest, for example, to move to a low carbon economy, although that there is some progress is happening out there in terms of, for example, investing in renewables, also navigating how the countries could also invest in other alternative fuels like the hydrogen. There's a lot of momentum out there, but in terms of real investments, there's still a huge gap out there. And I think also another issue, which is really important, is the lack of the studies that shows the co-benefits for the countries to invest in the low carbon economy. For example, what would be the revenues that could come if the countries invest in renewable energy and other alternative energy resources? How could the economies be more competitive in the future if they invest, in hydrogen, and do not just rely on the business as usual and the traditional way of producing energy? And how many jobs can be created out there? And what are the opportunities also that the clean energy transition could bring to the economic diversification? We don't have much studies that shows the co-benefits that can be achieved. We talked about it like climate change is a risk, is a threat, and that is maybe what prevent the policymakers to pay the good attention to the issue of the climate change.
Right. And all of this, of course, is very much going to be a focus at this year's climate change conference, COP27. Amma, something that's coming through with the questions here is, given the crises that people are facing, the dust storms, the droughts, and everything else that's going on across the region, and then the privations they have to go through just to live day to day, the validity of these big climate conferences comes into question, doesn't it? I mean, really? Tens of thousands of delegates gather in one place. We see it year after year, and yet the progress is limited, the progress is slow. How valid are these big climate conferences? How important are they? Can't we just do it another way?
Well, let me give a quick response. We probably need to add additional formats to reach some of the objectives which haven't been met effectively. And I'm not referring to announcements, which haven't been met effectively in the different COP meetings. So we probably, and that really goes back to your point about awareness and the point made by the previous speakers on the need for civil society, on the need for MENA citizens to get engaged in issues related to climate change and its challenges. We've got to figure out different formats of activating civil society discussion and debating about climate change.
What kind of formats are you thinking of? What sort of things are you thinking of?
I believe when you look at the region, for example, and once again, there is a very valid point which was made about regional diplomacy and diplomacy around climate change, the need for cooperation schemes, the need for collaboration schemes, government to government. We've got to figure out collaboration schemes, civil society to civil society, in terms of public opinion building measures, in terms of engagement with citizens. We have to drive home to citizens in the region that climate change is not a luxury. It does not mean that we're ignoring lingering crises, poverty, unemployment, issues pertaining to political rights and civil freedoms, and this all we have to live with, or state disintegration. It's all key. but climate change is key as well. So you need to figure out, in addition to COP27, in addition to COP meetings, including COP27, which is coming up soon, you need to figure out how civil society can get active and engaged. And here, civil society should engage regionally and engage across the region. And here is the second point I would like to make. We have a clear divide. If you leave the MENA region aside for a second and look at the macro global picture, we have a clear divide between developed and developing countries. We have a clear divide between the global north and the global south. And what I'm honestly interested in, without pushing the argument too far, that it is on the developed countries to come forward with their pledges. Part of it is exactly this. But part of it is a global south, and that is, I'm hoping, will be what will happen in COP27, the first COP in Africa, the first COP with an Africa-based presidency, the Egypt presidency. We have to activate global south initiatives as well in the MENA and beyond. North African countries, Arab North African countries can play a central role in coordinating and reaching out in climate relevant projects and proposals across the global south in Africa and beyond. Third point I would like to make on, how can we reactivate or get some of what we are missing and pledges which are not met, is basically to take a fresh look at how to, and that part of it is the public debate, and part of it is the policy and the policy making and policy planning and policy making. Climate change is not only a set of risks, it's a set of opportunities as well. And so we need to shift the global debate around climate change from simply injecting too much risk, too much fear. I'm not saying undermine it. And I read the report on the emissions gap, which came out yesterday. Of course, it's very alarming. We need a bit of alarmist tones, of course, but we also need to shift the parameters of the debate in the region and globally to opportunities related to green technology, green economies. How can we create? And there are some projections. Saudi Arabia, for example, has launched a national plan, a national strategy for the green economy. And if you look at the details, I mean, you can believe it, take it as factual, or even if you have some doubts, ultimately, shifting into a green economy will create more job opportunities, will diversify the economy more in Saudi Arabia, will create a better resilience in Saudi Arabia, and it will not be only subjected to fluctuations in oil prices. The same goes for other countries too. Aisha,
I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, if I can. So yes, so the COPs have, this is the COP27, right? Whether we put a hope on it or not, I think. So since the establishment of the UNFCCC 30 years ago, there has, I think, this international multilateral governance of climate has been maybe so far more of the playing a bigger role in pushing the countries to do something about the climate change, rather than the bottom-up approach that's happening, that we hope that would happen from countries themselves. For the Middle East, for the MENA region itself, the MENA region all the time have been experiencing the top-down governance approach. So what will push for more of a climate action is what will come, is the pressure that comes from outside the international governance of the climate change. I would say I am hopeful that COP27 could make a change. Why? Because this COP is actually preparing for what is called the global stocktake, which is the mechanism that will be used to assess the progress of the countries are making in terms of implementing climate measures, in terms of the adaptation and the mitigation.
And we know that gap is, what needs to be done and where we're at is a million miles apart, right?
The gap is huge. And the Environmental Performance Index that is published by Yale, the MENA countries are not at the top 20s yet. The first country from the Middle East you can see is the UAE, which is number 39, I guess. And none of them is, making the top 20 yet. Well, the gap is huge, but do we expect the bottom-up approach from the MENA countries to take a place, or do we need an external pressure? So I would put hope on the COP27 and the COP28, especially that they are happening in the Middle East, now in Egypt this year and the UAE next year. And I would put hope on also the global stock-take mechanism, which will put pressure not only in the MENA, but on the countries globally. Although we know the Paris Agreement is not a legally binding agreement, it's still voluntary agreement. But with this global stocktake and this transparency mandate, I would put hope there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Aisha. Zeinab, do you want to come back on that? And then I want to pose a question to all of you. So, Zeinab, first of all, your response to what Aisha and Ahmad have been saying.
No, I absolutely agree with both, right? I agree that a response needs to be multi-level and multi-layered, right? It's not effective, it's not sustainable to focus only on top-down respond. This is what, we are dealing with an existential crisis in the MENA region, right? The problem here is that if there is no response to climate change, and if the response to climate change is not effective in the region, like Omar said, some parts of the region will become uninhabitable. And so you can imagine the level of the social crisis, the political crisis, the economic crisis, the climate migration, that's really going to bleed beyond the region toward global stability. We're talking about the stability of the energy market. We saw what happened with Russia and just one country, how really impacted prices and economic stability. So you can imagine what will happen when a region that's really essential to the energy market, experience a climate crisis as expected. And so really it needs to be a multi-level approach. It really needs to be something where citizens are involved, communities are engaged, civil activism are there to present challenge to existing policies, where political actors have this understanding that eventually climate change is not going to only impact the stability of the region, but it's going to impact the economic system, the oil production system that allow them to survive and sustain their political regimes in the long run. And then there need to be sort of regional diplomacy and regional steps to address that. And I too share that hope that Aisha shared, is that now that we have these conversations, we have these events happening this year and next year in the MENA region, is that maybe for the very first time, not only conflict and other crises are prioritized when we speak about the MENA region, but climate will be the focus, and climate crises and climate solutions will be the focus. And so for COP27, for me to be successful, it really needs for the conversation to shift not only and stay only within the walls of the conference center, but it really needs to shift to communities and how communities engage with these conversations, specifically those who are already displaced, those who are already dealing with the consequences of climate change, and how can we include them into this conversation and include their own solution into this conversation on the long run? Because, again, indigenous communities have knowledge and have resilience of the land where they live, and they know how to deal with it. So they need to be included in this conversation as well.
Indeed, the conversation needs to be across the board, doesn't it? This question I wanted to talk about, we've mentioned the UNEP emissions gap report that came out yesterday. And I don't know about you, but I got a very real sense of a dialing back of expectations there. If you just listen to what the UN Environment Programme boss, Inga Anderson, had to say, she said, it is a tall and some would say impossible order to reform the global economy and almost halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which is what we need to do, and to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But we must try, she says, even if we don't meet our 2030 goals, we must strive to get as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I mean, this is a global pertinence, not specifically to the MENA region, but it obviously affects the MENA region. Amma, first of all, do you get the sense that the impossibility almost of the task of getting where we need to be by 2030 is now being accepted? And to achieve anything, we have to set our sights lower to gain ground.
I believe so. I mean, I'm a strong believer in realpolitik assessments instead of putting forward a rosy picture which no longer applies. And therefore, COP27 is coming to be quite a critical COP indeed, because we can no longer deny globally that humanity will not make it to the announced objectives for 2030. And even there is some doubt, which is being cast on the objectives for 2050 as well. I mean, we have two big benchmarks, and probably none will be reached. So it's better to take stock, and therefore, what, if I'm not mistaken, Aisha was saying in the beginning on the global stock take mechanism is quite important. We have to readjust, we have to recalibrate, and make it in a reality driven, not in a rosy picture like way, which no longer applies. And I believe in doing so, we're disenfranchising, which is more important from a political science perspective. We are disenfranchising citizens, because unless you come across and inform your citizens, your respective population and globally about what's going on, you cannot depend on them becoming active on saving scarce water resources, or managing their energy consumption in a different way, and so on and so forth. So that is important to do. The second point is, I would love this time, and therefore I'm as hopeful as my co-speakers, that with COP happening in the global south, Middle East, Africa, Middle East, Egypt, and the UAE, in a way, the negotiated new objectives, and I wouldn't say downgraded objectives, but the negotiated set of objectives, which will probably happen in COP27, I hope it will have more of a buy-in, of an input, and a buy-in from the global south in general. I am quite concerned that what we have been seeing in many COP meetings, and I'm not referring to theatrics of delegates and so on and so forth, but in terms of the effective outcome, the imprint of the global north is way stronger, is way more, structurally more than the global south. And that needs to be addressed in terms of objectives, addressed in terms of historical responsibilities. And once again, it's not that I'm only pushing this one narrative of the developed countries have to come forward and deliver. But it's part of it. It's part of it, and it needs to be addressed. And the global south has its own vision too. Zeinab was referring to local communities, which is a great point, because looking around and doing the research which I've been doing in the last month, and I'm following up, and I'm participating in COP as well. Local communities in the Middle East and North Africa know well how to save, how to conserve resources, how to save. And even some of the traditional ways should not be ruled out completely as anti-environmental or as environmentally insensitive. This is not true. We just have to have a critical look, and you have to enable the global south to be an integral part of the debate, not only a recipient of financial pledges which never come, or of announced objectives where we haven't had a chance to have our imprint on them as well.
Perhaps there should be a COP solely for the global south.
But I wouldn't say so. I mean, the premise is of global cooperation, but we have a huge set of countries which has been marginalized for a very long time, and bringing them back in should not only be bringing them back in terms of sit down and say what you want, and then we put the imprint we believe in. No, I mean, this needs to be a true partnership, and not only government to government. It has to be civil society across nation-state borders.
Okay. Zeinab, do you want to come back to that? And then also this question of how do you give the global south a greater voice?
That's the challenge, right? I think that oftentimes there are two issues here. First of all, when we talk about the global north and we are talking about powerful countries, we need to be realistic that they are countries with their own interests, with their own self-interest, their own powers, their own economic and political goals. And sometimes these things don't align with the interests of the global south. So realistically speaking, when we are talking about supporting the global south, we need to address that the support is not only because it's inefficient, but sometimes it's intentionally not that well because countries are self-interested actors. But if you want to support the global south in a serious way, I think that it's essential to listen to what people saying in these countries. It's not about just pushing money into countries in the global south and imposing policies from outside and imposing institutional structural changes from the outside. A lot of the change needs to happen organically. and it needs to address the unique structural conditions, cultural conditions, unique economic and political institutions that exist in these countries, and how they can adapt effectively. And that means listening to what the people in these places are saying and what they need, and listen to multiple actors, not only political elites, not only specific actors within civil society, but those that generally don't get to attend the fancy workshops, don't get invited to the nice conferences, and listen to their interests and listen to their own solutions. And if money and support and policies can be given, it need to be given as a collaboration, not as sort of an aid of this is what I think is good for you and you need to do it. Without some organic change from within, and without realistically realizing that many countries are self-interested actors and they're not necessarily always going to work for the interests of all, and they're prioritizing their own interests, and sometimes instability is good for some countries, then that will be more of a realistic approach to how voices and real solutions on the ground can be applied and introduced.
Aisha.
Sure. So I would like to go back to the emission gap report and whether it is realistic or is possible to achieve that target. I think in terms of finding or putting a pressure on finding solutions to the climate change, who played a critical role for that kind of movement is the scientists. The scientists are the ones who are identifying the impacts of the climate change and identifying the risks. But I think the science for a long time has focused on just putting an emphasis on the risks and the impacts. We have not put enough effort in terms of doing research on learning about the co-benefits of climate action, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And if we speak about the Gulf Arab states, and agree with the speakers when they say we need to understand the context of where this transformation is happening. So if we speak about the Gulf Arab states, for example, the oil export revenues is playing a critical role, not only for the economy, but for those countries also to adapt to the climate change. The oil and the gas is playing the role to, enhancing and ensuring that there is a water security, there is an energy security for the region. The water desalination happens because there is oil out there. So the transformation or making the balance between the climate mitigation or the low carbon economic transition as well as adaptation to the climate change is going to be a challenge for this specific region, although it has the wealth and it has the capacity to do so. However, what I think we should do from at least the science point of view is to do more of a research on understanding the core benefits of increasing the investments in the low carbon economy, and what for the GCC, how could that contribute for the economic diversification and enhancing the role of small medium enterprises in the economy because of the enhancing the climate action, both in terms of the mitigation and the adaptation. So I think the pressure could also, since the climate scientists played a critical role to identify the risk of climate change, they also could play a critical role also in pushing for the solutions to the climate. And again, we need to be realistic in terms of the context that we are dealing with. I think that would create the push that we need.
Finally, if I can put to all of you, so what are we, 10 days away from this COP27? What is your sense? Zeinab, let's start with you. What is your sense? What would be, for you, what would be the biggest positive to come out of this climate conference, taking us into the UAE next year? What needs to happen as far as the region is concerned?
So, like I mentioned, I am happy that it's happening in the region, and it's hopefully centering the voices of folks in the global south and countries there. And so that's a positive thing. And prioritizing climate change if in the MENA region, when usually other issues tend to be prioritized when we look at the region. So there's already a positive thing happening. But I'm also a sociologist, so I'm generally a pessimist. And I will say that the positive thing for me will be a reckoning, a clear, realistic examination that the current political and economic structure that we have in the region is not sustainable. Of course, the region is not a monolith. Not every single country is the same. Not every institution capacity is going to be the same. But when we think of something like oil economies, even though not every country in the region is an oil producing country, that nature of the economic system really shapes the economic structure in the region. It shapes trade in the region. We are dealing with a crisis of democratization. In fact, we are less democratic since the Arab Spring, so we kind of went backwards. So a lot of these things are necessary to sustain an effective climate response, to increase climate resilience, and to have a clear understanding that what we have right now in terms of political and economic systems will not be sustainable on the long run. I think that realization, if we just can get to that realization, that itself is a progress toward creating effective, realistic policies on the ground.
Thank you, Zeinab. Amma, how about you? What for you would be the biggest positive to come out of this conference?
Well, I agree with Zeinab's benchmarks. Political scientists are oftentimes more pessimistic than sociologists. However, and given what's going on around us globally and regionally, there is very little, I would say, very little reason for unconditional optimism. So my optimism is conditional, and it's conditioned to two big issues. Number one, I'm very hopeful, and I'm very concerned about the Global South and the role of the Global South in climate change-related debates, global debates, policy outcome, programs, and so on and so forth. So I'm hopeful in Sharm and in the UAE next year that the Global South will play a greater role in redefining climate change objectives in light of what we were just saying about sort of recalibrating and taking stock of what has been happening in the last years and how to come up with a set of realistic objectives which can be met. I am hopeful that the Global South, governments as well as civil societies, increasingly gradually informed citizens will take a greater role in COP27 and then COP28. Secondly, and here as well pertaining to the Global South, I'm hopeful that the Egyptian presidency and the UAE presidency will see their roles as primarily Global South presidencies and trying to push forward regional cooperation from an Egyptian perspective within Africa and the MENA region, from a UAE perspective in the MENA region and beyond in Asia, but as well as for Latin America, we need to get going on not simply schemes coming from developed countries and being imposed on a single country in the Global South, be it institutionally or monies coming in or institutional resources, but simply that we in the Global South come up with a set of initiatives which are relevant and where we can negotiate and exchange with the Global North to an extent as a bloc, not as a sort of a bloc against a second bloc, but in a way collectively. This collective effort needs to happen. So these are my two benchmarks for COP27. The third benchmark is Egyptian, which is to get Egyptian civil society, and I couldn't agree more with what Zeinab was saying on not the fancy conference attending organizations, not the usual suspects, but the real organizations on the ground, which have been doing work with regard to climate change, with regard to water resources, that we give them a space to articulate their agendas, to share their visions, and to engage in the region and beyond. This would be my hope for Egypt too.
Amma, thank you. Aisha, last word to you. Very little reason for unconditional optimism, but Amma has found, and indeed Zeinab has found, ways and means by which we can try and look for optimism in the future.
Yes, picking up on the last point that Amr has mentioned, that maybe the concern is not really what will happen during the COP itself or the negotiations themselves. For the Middle East, since the impacts of the climate change are here, what really matters is the action on the ground and whether the host of the COP will have a spillover in terms of mobilizing the action on the ground. Now, the Egypt and the UAE, since they are hosting, I think we do see some kind of a change and progress when it comes to the discussion about the climate change issues in the region. Now, in the region, the discussion about climate change 5 years ago is not that much. But given that Egypt and the UAE are hosting the COPs in these 2 years, it is actually putting a pressure not only on those countries to showcase their, initiatives and commitment to climate change, but also to the regional countries in the region. For example, we are seeing countries are, for example, the UAE has updated its second national determined contribution, and it has also established some initiatives that helps to mobilize climate action on the ground. Egypt itself has updated its nationally determined contribution and put a greenhouse gas emission target. Also, we have seen, announcements for the net zero carbon emissions. 4 countries in the region have announced their commitments: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, and Bahrain. That is a progress. This is something that nobody speaks about before, but I think that is a progress in a way, at least at the government level. And we really need the awareness at the government level, at least given that the governance structure in the MENA region is more of a top-down structure. So I think the entry point will be the government. And, because these countries are hosting the COP, we already have seen collaboration between the countries. For example, the UAE is hosting the COP next year, is now working with Egypt, and they have those discussions. And we also have been seeing some multilateral cooperation in addressing climate issues. A recent example is between the Jordan and the Israel and the UAE for the exchange of the water and the renewable energy. There is a push out there. There is a kind of a movement. And I think this will also spill over in other sectors like the education sector. Because again, the government would also play a role in integrating climate science in the education, and it is happening somehow. So although some MENA countries in the past hosted the COP and we haven't seen much of a change, I think these would be different. And again, I will go back and put my hope on the global stocktake because mechanism and the transparency, because these are putting pressures on the governments to do something about it.
Aisha, Amr, and Zeinab, thank you very much. We've covered a great deal of ground from the challenges for the MENA region in dealing with the urgency of the climate crisis, which deeply, deeply affects the region with its impacts, and the need indeed for a greater focus and, importantly, voice for the global south, and the need to push forwards on regional cooperation. Fantastic having you with us. It's been a brilliant discussion. We could go on for a very long time, but then we'll leave that to the COP itself, because that will go on for hours and hours and days, as we all know. But in the meantime, Aisha Ansari, Amr Hamzawy, and Zeinab Shuker, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you too to our audience for tuning in. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you.